Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into the world of biotech, specifically focusing on Aldeyra Therapeutics, ticker symbol ALDX.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of buzz around this company lately, especially after that second FDA complete response letter they got for Reproxalap.
Right, that second CRL was a big deal, definitely made headlines, but we're not just going to skim the surface here. We're going deeper. We're going to break down a full research plan on Aldeyra, so by the end of this, you'll be way ahead of the curve, really understand the company.
Exactly. We've got all the key insights from this research plan all boiled down so you can get the info you need without having to wade through pages and pages of data.
Perfect. That's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive. So, to lay it all out, we're going to tackle this in a few stages, just like the research plan does. First up, we'll get a handle on their business, what they actually do, who's running the show, their financials, that kind of stuff.
Right, the fundamentals.
Then we'll shift gears and look at what the market's saying about them, how ownership is structured, and of course the risks involved. We're covering all the bases here, folks, and stick around until the very end. We've got a thought-provoking question about Aldeyra's future that'll really get you thinking. Something that goes beyond what we directly cover. All right, let's jump into Chapter 1, Business Understanding.
Perfect. So, Aldeyra, at its core, is a biotech company. Their focus is developing new treatments for immune-mediated diseases. And they've got this interesting technology they're using called reactive aldehyde species modulation. RASP for short.
Ah, yes, RASP. We'll definitely dig into that more. And of course, we have to talk about Reproxalap, their lead product candidate. That second CRL from the FDA for dry eye disease was a pretty significant setback.
It was, yeah. Reproxalap is their most advanced candidate, and there were a lot of hopes pinned on it, so that second CRL was definitely a blow. But before we get too deep into that, maybe a little background on Aldeyra itself.
Sure, that'd be helpful.
So the company has gone through a few name changes. Started as Neuron Systems back in 2004, then switched to Aldeyra Therapeutics, and finally landed on Aldeyra Therapeutics in 2014.
Interesting. So they've been around for a while, evolving over time. What's their core mission, though? What are they ultimately trying to achieve?
Well, they're dedicated to developing treatments for a pretty wide range of conditions. We're talking immune-mediated diseases, inflammatory diseases, even some rare orphan diseases.
Okay, so a pretty diverse range of targets. But what's the common thread linking all these conditions?
They believe all these diseases are at least partly driven by something called free aldehydes.
Free aldehydes. So these are like harmful compounds that the body produces.
Exactly. Naturally occurring, but potentially harmful. And that's where their RASP modulators come into play. They're designed to trap and break down these free aldehydes.
Okay, so it's kind of like a targeted approach, right? Instead of just broadly suppressing the immune system, they're going after these specific culprits, these free aldehydes.
Right. Think of it like this. Imagine those free aldehydes are little tiny troublemakers causing irritation in the body. And the RASP modulators are like specialized cleanup crews sent in to neutralize them.
Gotcha, makes sense. So we've got Reproxalap as their star player, but what else is in their pipeline? Any other potential game changers?
They do have a few other interesting candidates. One is ADX 2191. It's an injectable form of methotrexate, specifically formulated for use in the eye.
Methotrexate, isn't that usually used for things like rheumatoid arthritis?
It is, yeah. But this particular formulation is for treating eye conditions. Specifically, they're looking at proliferative vitreoretinopathy, retinitis pigmentosa, and primary vitreoretinal lymphoma.
Those are some pretty serious eye diseases, and some of them are quite rare, right?
Right. Especially retinitis pigmentosa and primary vitreoretinal lymphoma. There's definitely a big need for new treatments in those areas.
Absolutely. So ADX 2191 is definitely one to watch. And they have some other candidates in earlier stages of development, right?
Yep. They've got ADX 629, ADX 248, ADX 743, ADX 631, and ADX 246.
Wow, that's a lot of numbers. Are those all targeting similar conditions?
They're all based on their RASP modulation technology, but aimed at a pretty diverse range of conditions. Some are for systemic diseases, some are for retinal diseases, even some potential applications in autoimmune disorders and cancer.
Interesting. So they're really exploring the potential of their RASP platform across a wide spectrum of diseases.
Exactly. They're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Smart move. So for folks who want to look up more basic info on Aldeyra, where can they go?
Their website is a good starting point, www.aldeyra.com. They're headquartered in Lexington, Massachusetts. And it's worth noting that they're classified as an emerging growth company.
Emerging growth company. That basically means they get some leeway with SEC reporting, right?
Right. Just something to keep in mind.
Huh.
Now let's talk about their stock performance. We mentioned that recent dip.
Yeah, investors were definitely spooked by that second CRL.
Understandably so. As of March 28, 2025, their stock was trading at $6.67. That gave them a market cap of around $398 million, with about 59.7 million shares outstanding.
Got it.
Their 52-week range at that time was between 3.1 and 7.2 euro dollars. But then that second CRL hit in April, and the stock took a pretty big hit.
How big are you talking?
Reports put the price around 1.79, maybe even as low as $1.39, which obviously had a huge impact on their market cap, dropping it down to somewhere between 107 and $350 million.
Ouch. That's a pretty steep fall. And I guess it highlights how volatile biotech stocks can be, right? News like that can really shake things up.
Definitely. It's a high-risk, high-reward kind of sector. And their trailing 12-month earnings per share as of December 31st, 2024 was negative $0.94, which isn't unusual for a biotech company still in the development stage.
Makes sense. They're investing heavily in research and trials.
Exactly. Now, switching gears a bit, let's talk intellectual property.
Yeah, that's a big deal for any company, but especially in biotech, where innovation is key. What does their IP portfolio look like?
It's pretty substantial. They have over 210 patent documents.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. 112 of those are granted patents, and 46 are still pending. The research plan highlighted some recent activity related to methods of using methotrexate, which likely ties into ADX 2191. And they also have some pending patents for those heterocyclic aldehyde trapping compounds, which are central to their RASP modulation technology.
So basically, these patents are like legal protection for their inventions, right?
Exactly. They prevent competitors from just copying their tech. And it can be a really valuable asset for attracting potential partners or even getting acquired.
Absolutely. Now, I noticed the research plan mentioned an acquisition. What was that all about?
Back in 2019, they acquired a company called Heliovision.
What did Heliovision bring to the table?
That acquisition is how they got ADX 2191, that intravitreal methotrexate we talked about.
Oh, right. So it was a strategic move to bolster their ophthalmology pipeline?
Exactly. They were specifically targeting those rare retinal diseases where there's a big unmet need for new treatments.
Makes sense. Okay, last thing on the business front. The research plan touched on ESG risk. What's the gist there?
So Sustainalytics, which is an ESG rating agency, gave them a severe risk rating with a score of 40.1. They also said Aldeyra's management of those ESG risks is weak.
So basically, there are some concerns about their environmental, social, and governance practices.
Right. It suggests they've got some work to do in those areas, especially compared to other companies in the pharmaceutical sector.
Okay, that's good context to have. Let's shift gears to Chapter 2, Management Evaluation. What's their business model in a nutshell?
Well, like a lot of biotech companies at this stage, they're focused on discovering, developing, and hopefully commercializing new drugs.
Makes sense.
But right now, they're still pre-revenue. They're not generating significant income from product sales. So their future really hinges on their ability to successfully develop and get regulatory approval for their drug candidates.
Right, it's all about getting those drugs to market. But they do have that potential revenue stream from the AbbVie partnership, right?
Exactly. That option agreement with AbbVie for Reproxalap in the U.S. is a big deal.
Can you remind us how that deal works?
So if AbbVie decides to exercise their option, and that recent CRL is definitely going to factor into their decision, Aldeyra gets an upfront payment. Then they're eligible for milestone payments based on reaching certain regulatory and commercial goals.
Okay, so that's like bonus cash if things go well.
Right. Plus, they get a share in the profits if Reproxalap actually gets sold in the U.S. The split is 60% to AbbVie and 40% to Aldeyra.
Not bad. So it's not just about the upfront cash, it's about having a strong partner for the whole process.
Exactly. AbbVie has the experience and resources to help with development, manufacturing, and commercialization, which is huge for a smaller company like Aldeyra.
Absolutely. We talked about Reproxalap earlier. Can you remind us how it works, that whole RASP modulation thing?
Sure. Reproxalap is considered a first-in-class small molecule RASP modulator. It's in late-stage development for both dry eye disease and allergic conjunctivitis.
First in class, that's a big deal, right?
It is. It means it's a totally new approach, different from other treatments out there.
Interesting. And what about ADX 2191, that intravitreal methotrexate? What kind of potential does that have?
So they're looking at it for a few different eye conditions: proliferative vitreoretinopathy, which is a complication after retinal surgery, and then also retinitis pigmentosa and primary vitreoretinal lymphoma.
We talked about those rare retinal diseases earlier.
Right. Those are areas where there's a huge need for new treatment options.
Definitely. And what are their goals for those earlier stage candidates?
Well, they're still in the early stages, but they're targeting a wide range of conditions: systemic diseases, more retinal diseases, even some potential applications in autoimmune disorders and cancer.
So it's all about exploring the full potential of that RASP platform.
Exactly. Now, to put it all in perspective, who are the actual patients they're aiming to help?
Yeah, that's an important question.
Their therapies are intended for people with a variety of immune-mediated and metabolic diseases. Right now, the most immediate focus is on people with dry eye disease and allergic conjunctivitis.
Makes sense since Reproxalap is their most advanced candidate.
Right. But with ADX 2191, they're also targeting those with rare retinal conditions. And their earlier stage candidates have the potential to help people with a whole range of inflammatory diseases.
So a pretty broad patient population overall.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that their approach is all about tackling the root cause of these diseases, not just masking the symptoms.
That's a key distinction. And speaking of commercialization, how are they planning to actually get these drugs to market if they get approved?
Well, for Reproxalap in the US, they've got that deal with AbbVie.
Right. But what about for other candidates or in other markets?
The research plan doesn't go into specifics on that, but generally, biotech companies have a few options.
Like what?
They could build their own sales teams, partner with larger pharmaceutical companies who already have a strong presence in the market, or even license the rights to other companies.
Okay, so a few different paths they could take.
Exactly. It'll depend on the specific drug, the target market, a whole bunch of factors.
Makes sense. All right, last question on management. What makes their research and development approach unique? What sets them apart?
Well, their core philosophy is all about modulating those protein systems, specifically RASP, to influence multiple disease pathways simultaneously.
Okay, so it's a multi-targeted approach.
Right. And they're doing it with the goal of minimizing toxicity. Their goal isn't just to treat the symptoms, but to potentially slow down or even halt disease progression.
So they're really trying to get at the root cause of these diseases.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to the financials. Chapter 3, Financial Health.
Money talks, right? So let's talk money. First and foremost, are they actually generating revenue yet?
The short answer is no. They're still pre-revenue. As of December 31st, 2024, they hadn't brought in any revenue from product sales. So their ability to actually make money is completely dependent on getting those drug candidates approved and out into the market, or on deals like the one they have with AbbVie.
Right, those partnerships are crucial. And what about their financial track record so far?
Well, they've been operating at a net loss. In 2022, their net loss was $62 million, and in 2021, it was $57.8 million.
Okay, so they're spending more than they're bringing in. That's not unusual for a company in this stage, right?
Right. Those losses are mainly due to the costs of running clinical trials, their ongoing research and development efforts, and the general costs of running the business.
Makes sense. So traditional profitability metrics don't really apply here, do they?
Not really. Metrics like gross margin, operating margin, and net margin aren't very meaningful for a pre-revenue company. Their future profitability is all about whether their drugs get approved and if they can successfully sell them.
Right. And that potential profit sharing with AbbVie could be a big factor, assuming Reproxalap gets approved.
Exactly. That could be a major revenue driver for them. But what about their cash situation? How much runway do they have?
Yeah, that's crucial.
As of December 31st, 2024, they reported having $101 million in cash, cash equivalents, and marketable securities.
Okay, so they've got a decent cushion for now. What does their balance sheet look like overall?
As of the end of 2024, they had total assets of $104.607 million and total debt of $15.303 million. So that suggests a pretty healthy balance sheet. And more recent reports show a current ratio of 5.59.
Current ratio, that basically means they have plenty of short-term assets to cover their short-term liabilities, right?
Exactly. They're in a good position to meet their short-term financial obligations. But what about their spending? Where's all that money going?
Yeah, that's always a key question.
Their total operating expenses for 2022 were $62.7 million. And the research plan specifically mentioned that they expect to spend about $6 million on those ongoing dry eye trials in 2025.
Most of that's already been spent, though, right?
Right. They incurred most of those costs in 2024, so that gives you an idea of where their money's going, mainly towards research and clinical trials.
Makes sense. All right, that gives us a solid understanding of Aldeyra's financial health. But before we move on to market sentiment and risk assessment, we need to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor.
Sounds
All right, before we jump into the second half of our deep dive, let's talk about a game changer in stock analysis. Imagine having the power to generate a full report, a podcast like this one, or even a video breakdown on any stock whenever you want. And you get to tailor the analysis to your level of understanding, just like we're doing here with these chapters. Well, stockanalytics.ai is building that. It's an interactive platform where you can ask direct questions about a stock, use voice commands to screen for new opportunities, and even analyze your current portfolio. You can stress test it, identify risks, the whole 9 yards. And here's the best part. You can join the beta now and get a 50% discount. Plus, there might even be opportunities to invest in the future of stockanalytics.ai itself. So head over to stockanalytics.ai. You can check out the demo and join the waiting list. Don't miss out on this. And now, let's get back to Aldeyra. We're moving on to Chapter 4, Market Sentiment. Time to see what the competition looks like.
All right, so let's start with the market for dry eye products. It's a big market. In 2023, anti-inflammatory drugs for dry eye were a $4.64 billion market.
Wow, that's huge. So who are the major players Aldeyra is up against?
It's a pretty crowded field, lots of big names. We're talking Santen, Bausch Health, Alcon, AbbVie, they own Allergan, now Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Sun Pharma, and Novaliq.
So Aldeyra is going up against some heavy hitters.
They are, but it's important to remember that Reproxalap works differently. It's a RASP modulator, which is a unique mechanism compared to a lot of the existing treatments out there.
Right, that could be a key differentiator.
Exactly. And then there's the allergic conjunctivitis market, another big one. Projections say it could reach a whopping $288.83 billion by 2033.
That's a massive market.
It is. Some of the key players in that space are Ajanta, Acorn, Alembic, Cipla, Johnson & Johnson again, Novartis, Sun Pharma, and Teva.
Okay, so Aldeyra is trying to break into 2 very competitive markets with Reproxalap.
Right. Now, moving on to ALDX 2191 and those rarer retinal diseases, the market for retinitis pigmentosa is growing steadily. It's expected to reach $27.17 billion by 2034.
That's significant growth.
Yeah.
Who are the main players in that space?
Some of the big ones are Spark Therapeutics. They're part of Roche. Now Johnson & Johnson, always a big player. Meragitix, Novartis, and Sun Pharma.
Okay, and what about primary vitreoretinal lymphoma?
That market's smaller but still growing. It's projected to hit $1.81 billion by 2031. Main players there are Novartis, Alcon Research, and Bausch & Lomb.
And methotrexate is already used to treat primary vitreoretinal lymphoma, right?
It is. So Aldeyra is entering a market with an existing treatment, but their formulation, ADX 2191, is specifically designed for delivery into the eye. So it could offer some advantages over the current standard of care.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on to Chapter 5, Ownership Structure. Who are the major stakeholders in Aldeyra?
So here's the thing. The research plan we're looking at doesn't actually give any specifics on their ownership structure.
Oh, really? That's kind of unusual.
It is. We don't have details on major shareholders or institutional ownership. That kind of info is usually in their SEC filings, but it wasn't included in this particular research plan.
All right, good to know. Let's move on then. Chapter 6, Risk Assessment. Time for a SWOT analysis. What are Aldeyra's main strengths?
They definitely have a few key strengths going for them. First off, their RSP modulation technology is unique. It's a novel approach that could give them a real edge.
Right, we talked about how that sets them apart.
Exactly. And they have a diverse pipeline. They're not just betting on Reproxalap. They've got multiple candidates targeting different indications.
Diversification is always a good thing.
Absolutely. And having those late-stage candidates like Reproxalap and ADX 2191 means they have potential near-term catalysts for growth.
Makes sense. What else?
Well, that partnership with AbbVie is a big plus. It gives them access to resources and expertise they wouldn't have on their own, and their cash position is strong. As of December 2024, they had over $100 million in cash and equivalents.
That's a good cushion to have.
Definitely. And lastly, their patent portfolio is pretty strong, which helps protect their technology and gives them some bargaining power.
Solid strengths overall, but what about their weaknesses? Where are they vulnerable?
Well, the biggest one right now is that they're still pre-revenue. They're completely dependent on clinical and regulatory success to start making money.
Right. That's the big hurdle for any biotech company.
It is. And that second FDA rejection for Reproxalap was a major setback.
Definitely. And the FDA had some specific concerns about their trial data and methodology, right?
It did. That's something they'll need to address. And their ESG rating is also a potential concern for some investors.
Okay, so those are some of their weaknesses.
Yeah.
But what about opportunities? What are some potential growth areas?
Well, the markets for dry eye disease and allergic conjunctivitis are both huge and growing. So if they can get Reproxalap approved, there's a lot of potential there.
Makes sense.
And there's a big unmet need for new treatments for those rare retinal diseases that ALDX 2191 is targeting. So that's another major opportunity.
Right, those are areas where new therapies are desperately needed.
Exactly. And there's always the potential for expanding their collaboration with AbbVie. Plus, advancing those earlier stage candidates could open up even more opportunities down the line.
Okay, so plenty of potential avenues for growth. But we also need to talk about threats. What are some of the biggest challenges they're facing?
Well, the competition in the ophthalmology space is fierce. They're up against some really big, well-established companies.
That's definitely a challenge.
And there's always the risk that their clinical trials could fail. That's just the nature of drug development. You never know for sure how things will turn out.
Right, it's a high-risk endeavor.
And there are always regulatory hurdles. Getting drugs approved is a long and complex process, and there's always the possibility of delays, especially after that CRL for Reproxalap.
Okay, so regulatory risk is a big one. What else?
Market volatility is always a concern. Biotech stocks can be especially sensitive to market swings, and there's the potential need for additional financing in the future.
Right, they might need to raise more capital to fund their operation.
Exactly, and then there's that ongoing class action investigation, which adds another layer of uncertainty.
Okay, so those are some serious threats they need to navigate. All right, let's move on to our final section, Chapter 7. Brief conclusion. What's the main takeaway here?
I think the main takeaway is that second CRL for Reproxalap was a huge blow to Aldeyra. It's really impacted their near-term prospects and their stock price.
Right, that was a defining moment.
It was. Now all eyes are on those upcoming trial results for dry eye disease. Those are expected in the second quarter of 2025.
So those results are going to be crucial.
Absolutely. And they have that Type A meeting scheduled with the FDA. They need to address the FDA's concerns and figure out how to move forward with a potential resubmission for Reproxalap.
Basically, the next few months are going to be critical for Aldeyra.
They are. It's a make-or-break moment.
Okay, so what's the bull case for Aldeyra? What are the arguments for investing?
The bull case rests on the belief that Reproxalap can still get approved eventually, that they can overcome these setbacks, and that their broader pipeline, beyond just Reproxalap, has real value. Plus, their partnership with AbbVie could pay off big time.
Okay, so there's still potential there. But what about the bear case? Why might someone be hesitant to invest?
Well, the regulatory risk is still very real. There's no guarantee they can satisfy the FDA. And they face tough competition in their target markets. Plus, there's always the risk of clinical trial failures. And they might need to raise more money, which could dilute existing shareholders. And the market sentiment right now is pretty negative, especially with that class action investigation hanging over them.
So it's a risky bet, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
What's the final recommendation from the research plan?
The recommendation is nuanced. For investors with a moderate risk tolerance, they suggest a hold rating. But for those with a high risk tolerance who really believe in Aldeyra's technology, a speculative buy is a possibility.
Okay, so it really depends on your individual risk appetite and how much faith you have in the company.
Exactly. But the bottom line is that the next few months are going to be crucial. Those trial results and their interactions with the FDA are going to determine the direction of the company.
All right, so to wrap up our deep dive into Aldeyra Therapeutics, we've seen that they have innovative technology, a diverse pipeline, but they're also facing significant challenges. The future is uncertain, and it all hinges on their ability to execute and navigate the regulatory landscape.
It's a classic biotech story. High risk, high reward.
And that brings us to our end hook. Given all the challenges and the promise of their technology, what single piece of data from those upcoming trials do you think will be the most critical indicator of Aldeyra's future success?
That's a great question, something to really ponder as we wait for those results.
Absolutely. And for more deep dives like this one, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive wherever you get your podcasts.
And for more financial insights and analysis, don't forget to subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel.
Now, a quick disclaimer. The information we discussed today is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. This analysis was based on the research plan we reviewed, and artificial intelligence was used in processing that information. Investing in the stock market always carries risks, and you should always do your own research and consult with a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions.
We encourage you to continue learning and thinking critically about Aldeyra Therapeutics and the broader biotech sector.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Until next time.